moving into a new house is supposed to feel like a fresh start. For me, it felt like a clean slate for my family. My parents, my younger brother, Danny, and me. The house was nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It wasn't perfect, some creaky floorboards and old plumbing, but it was ours. Yet, from the moment we arrived, one thing felt off. The neighbor. We first saw him on moving day. He stood across the street in the shadow of his massive oak tree, arms folded, watching us. The guy gave me the creeps. He was tall, with a sun-weathered face and a perpetual scowl. His eyes were sharp and unblinking like a hawk. I nudged Danny and whispered, "Don't stare." My mom, ever the optimist, waved at him cheerfully. He didn't wave back. Instead, he turned and walked toward his garage, where he yanked a large black trash bag off the ground and dragged it to his truck. The bag looked heavy, sagging in the middle, and his movements seemed labored. He tossed it in the back like it was nothing and disappeared inside his house. Danny, curious and bold as ever, muttered, "What do you think's in the bag?" "Trash," I replied, but even then I wasn't convinced. That first night in the house, I struggled to sleep. I was still adjusting to the strange creaks and groans of the new place. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint, rhythmic noise. Thud, drag, thud, drag. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside. I crept to my window and peeked through the blinds. The neighbor was there, dragging another black bag across his driveway, heading toward his truck. He paused, as if sensing he was being watched, and turned his head toward my house. I ducked down instantly, my breath catching in my throat. The next morning, I told Danny. I saw him again last night. He was dragging another bag to his truck. Danny's eyes lit up with excitement. "What if he's a murderer?" he joked, grinning like the little horror junkie he was. "Yeah, right," I said. But deep down, the thought lingered. The neighbor's backyard was dotted with wooden birdhouses, dozens of them, all intricately carved and painted, hanging from trees like ornaments. I noticed them while taking the trash out one evening. My mom mentioned his hobby in passing, calling it charming. But something about those birdhouses unnerved me. They were all slightly different, some with jagged edges, others painted in dark, ominous shades. Why would someone make birdhouses if they don't even have birds? Danny asked one afternoon as we spied from the backyard. "Maybe they're for decoration," I suggested, though it felt like a weak explanation. We didn't see birds near his yard, not ever. The noises from his garage started about a week after we moved in. They were faint at first, a low mechanical hum that could easily be dismissed, but they grew louder with each passing night. The sound of power tools, heavy objects being moved, and occasionally muffled thuds. My dad noticed too. One night, as we sat in the living room, the sound of a saw whirring carried through the walls. "What the hell is he doing over there at this hour?" Dad muttered, shaking his head. "Maybe he's working on another birdhouse," Mom said, though even she looked uneasy. Danny's fascination only grew. "We have to find out what he's doing," he whispered to me later that night. "Let's sneak over and look in the garage." "Are you insane? What if he catches us?" I hissed back, but Danny wouldn't let it go. One Friday night after our parents had gone to bed, Danny convinced me to go outside with him. Armed with flashlights, we tiptoed across the lawn to the neighbor's driveway. His garage door was slightly open, just enough to see inside. My heart raced as we crouched down and peered out through the gap. The garage was cluttered with tools, sawdust, and planks of wood. In the center of the room was a large, tarp-covered object, but it was too dark to make out any details. The only movement came from the neighbor himself, who stood at a workbench with his back to us, sawing a thick piece of wood. Danny shifted, accidentally kicking a loose pebble. The sound echoed louder than it should have, and the neighbor froze. He turned toward the garage door, his face partially obscured by shadows. "Run!" I whispered harshly, grabbing Danny's arm. We sprinted back to the house, diving into our beds just as the sound of his footsteps reached the driveway. The next morning, I woke to the sound of police sirens. My parents were already outside talking to officers parked in the cul-de-sac. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping out onto the porch. "Someone reported a missing hiker in the area," my mom said. "They think he might have wandered into the woods behind the neighborhood." I glanced toward the neighbor's house. He was standing in his yard, watching the commotion with his usual unreadable expression. "They should check his garage," Danny whispered beside me. I elbowed him to shut up. 2 nights later, I saw him dragging another black bag to his truck, but this time he didn't leave right away. Instead, he opened the truck bed and pulled out something wrapped in a stained tarp. My stomach churned as he carried it to the backyard, disappearing behind the rows of birdhouses. Danny couldn't resist. "We have to follow him," he said. Against my better judgment, we crept through the shadows to the edge of his yard. From behind a tree, we watched as he dug a shallow hole and placed the tarp inside. He covered it with dirt and patted it down with his shovel, his movements methodical and eerily calm. Danny pulled out his phone to record, but the faint sound of the camera app made the neighbor look up. Our eyes met. "Run," I whispered again, and we bolted back to the house. The next evening, Danny was gone. I searched the house, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I thought about the neighbor and the tarp in the backyard. I ran to my parents. "Danny's missing," I blurted out. They called the police, but I couldn't wait. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door. He answered, his face calm but cold. "What do you want?" he asked. "My brother's missing," I said, my voice shaking. "Have you seen him?" His lips curled into a faint smirk. "You shouldn't snoop where you don't belong," he said, before slamming the door in my face. Desperation took over. I ran to the backyard, shining my flashlight on the freshly dug dirt. Ignoring the cold, I started digging with my hands, praying I wouldn't find what I feared most. The tarp emerged, heavy and damp. I pulled it open and found wooden birdhouses. Confused and relieved, I didn't notice the neighbor until he grabbed me from behind, dragging me toward the garage. Inside the garage, the tarp-covered object from before was gone. In its place was a freezer, slightly ajar. "Curiosity killed the cat," the neighbor said, pulling out a hunting knife. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you don't end up like the others." "Others?" I stammered, struggling against his grip. "The hikers. They trespass, they snoop, and they pay the price, just like your brother will." Before he could strike, a flash of red and blue lights filled the garage. The police had arrived. Guns drawn. The neighbor dropped the knife, his face twisting in rage as they cuffed him. Danny was found in the woods, tied up but unharmed. The neighbor's dark secret unraveled in the days that followed. The missing hikers, the gruesome trophies, and the birdhouses, each one dedicated to a victim. We moved out shortly after, but I'll never forget the neighbor's final words as they led him away. "You should have stayed out of my garage." When I first moved into the house next to yours, I thought it was a fresh start. The neighborhood seemed idyllic. Tree-lined streets, well-kept gardens, and the hum of a community that was alive but not too invasive. It was exactly what I needed after my divorce. A quiet place to rebuild my life. The house itself was old but sturdy, with creaky wooden floors and a smell of history baked into the walls. I didn't mind, I liked the charm. The first time I saw the man next door, I didn't think much of him. He was standing in his yard, staring intently at a row of rose bushes as though they might reveal some secret. His clothes were neat but outdated, his posture rigid. When he noticed me looking, he smiled. A slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, his voice smooth but flat, like a recording played just a little too slow. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "Nice roses." He chuckled, though it sounded rehearsed. "They're my pride and joy. I've spent years cultivating them. You'll find this is a quiet place. People value their privacy here." There was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy. His gaze lingered a beat too long before he turned back to his bushes, dismissing me without another word. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice things. At first, it was small, a shadow in the upstairs window of his house at odd hours, even though the lights were off. Faint sounds of movement when everything else was still. Once, while walking my dog late at night, I saw him standing in his backyard, staring up at the sky. His face was tilted, his expression blank, and he didn't respond when I called out a greeting. The sense of unease grew. I found myself avoiding him, crossing the street if I saw him outside. But it wasn't until the third month that I realized something was truly wrong. It was a Saturday night, and I was settling in with a glass of wine when I heard it. A low, rhythmic, scraping sound. coming from the direction of his house. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I listened, I realized it was too deliberate, too steady. Against my better judgment, I crept to the window and peered out. The man was in his backyard, dragging a heavy black bag across the ground. He paused, looking around as though sensing he was being watched, and for a moment, our eyes met. My breath caught in my throat as his expression shifted into something cold and unreadable. He dropped the bag and walked toward my house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. "Good evening," he said when I opened it a crack. His smile was as thin as ever. "I thought I saw you watching. I wanted to let you know there's no need to worry. Just some old junk I'm clearing out." "Right," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt at casualness. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Why don't you come by tomorrow? I'd like to show you something. A project I've been working on." Every instinct screamed at me to decline, but I forced a nod. "Sure, tomorrow." The smile returned, wider this time. "Excellent. I'll see you at noon." I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that the man was just a little odd but harmless. By the time noon arrived, curiosity had overridden my fear, and I found myself standing at his door. The house was as meticulous inside as it was outside. Not a speck of dust, not a single object out of place. He led me to the basement, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder as though steering me. "You'll find this fascinating," he said. The basement was enormous, far larger than I expected. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of strange substances, some murky, some clear. But what drew my attention was the centerpiece, a large table, covered in blueprints, photographs, and what looked like anatomical diagrams. What is all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Research," he replied. "Years of it. I've been studying human behavior, patterns, instincts. You might say I'm a collector." It was then that I noticed the photographs. They weren't random. They were of people, neighbors, including me. I took a step back, my pulse pounding. "I think I should go." He moved quickly, blocking the stairs. "I can't let you do that," he said, his voice calm, almost apologetic. "You've seen too much." I bolted, shoving past him with more strength than I thought I had. I stumbled up the stairs, the sound of his footsteps close behind. My mind raced as I darted through the house, searching for an exit. He was faster than I expected, and every time I thought I'd gained some distance, he was there, his presence relentless. I managed to grab a heavy lamp from a side table and swung it, catching him across the temple. He fell, momentarily stunned, and I sprinted for the door. The neighborhood was eerily quiet as I ran, my shouts for help echoing into the void. I didn't stop until I reached your house. You opened the door, your face a mask of confusion and concern as I babbled about the man and his collection. The police arrived quickly. They searched his house and found the basement exactly as I described, only it was worse. The jars contained preserved body parts. The blueprints detailed methods of capturing and manipulating his victims. And the photographs, there were dozens, spanning years. But the most chilling discovery was the trapdoor hidden beneath the basement floor. Inside, they found a room filled with chains and restraints. Some of the neighbors who had moved away were still there, alive but broken. The man was arrested, his expression calm and unrepentant as they led him away. I wish I could say it ended there, but sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. I hear faint scraping sounds and catch glimpses of shadows where there shouldn't be any. And sometimes I wonder, what if he wasn't working alone?